The document on the council table was dated 6 weeks ago. It described the assassination attempt in complete, specific detail: the method, the corridor, the hour, the entry point, the name of the person inside the palace who had left the lock unprepared. Every detail was accurate. Every detail had been submitted through the palace's standard administrative channels 6 weeks before the attempt occurred, and had not reached a single person with the authority to act on it. The document had been filed by a low-ranking Omega Palace worker assigned to linen inventory. Her personnel record noted a chronic sleeping condition that made her unsuitable for more demanding duties. King Kale was alive. He had not known her name this morning. He knew it now. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The linen inventory assignment had been Neva's third position in 11 months. The first had been in the kitchen, which had lasted 6 weeks before the supervisor had filed for her reassignment on the grounds of unreliability specifically. For instances of late arrival in a single month, the longest of which had been 22 minutes. The second had been in the palace's document copy room, which had lasted 3 months before the senior copier had requested her transfer because her tendency to fall asleep at the copying desk was creating, in his written assessment, a workflow disruption inconsistent with the room's operational standards. The linen inventory assignment was where the palace's administrative machinery put people it had decided were not functional for anything else. She understood this. She had understood it at each stage of the 3 reassignments, had absorbed the specific institutional message each one carried, had noted it with the patient attention she gave to all information about her environment, and had continued existing. This was not resignation. It was the specific practical wisdom of someone who had spent 21 years learning to operate within conditions they had not chosen and could not change. The work itself was manageable. 3 hours of actual labor in the mornings, counting, condition assessment, supply requests, rotation logging performed with the careful thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered. Because thoroughness was the one form of contribution available to her regardless of what position she occupied. The remaining hours were technically unscheduled, which meant she could use them to sleep in the storage alcove that had become, without anyone formally acknowledging it, her unofficial afternoon quarters. She slept in the alcove. She slept everywhere she could, whenever she could, because her body required it with the specific insistence of something that was not laziness or illness, but was the irreducible cost of a gift that worked around the clock regardless of what her waking life required. She had explained this to one supervisor once in the 3rd month of her first year, and the explanation had been received with the specific polite blankness of someone who had already decided what category she occupied and was not going to reclassify it based on her account of her own experience. She had not explained it again. The court's contempt for her drowsiness was expressed in the specific social register of people who found her too low-ranked to be worth cruelty, but not low-ranked enough to be invisible. She was in the uncomfortable middle zone of institutional mockery, present enough to be noticed, insufficiently important to be treated with any particular consideration either way. The kitchen staff had called her the sleeping Omega. The document copy room had circulated a wager about how long before she fell asleep on a given day. The linen inventory colleagues had stopped doing either not from kindness, from the specific boredom of people who had moved past the mockery phase into the territory of simply not caring. She found the boredom preferable. What none of them knew, what no one in the palace knew, was that the sleeping Omega in the linen alcove was doing the most consequential work in the palace every time her eyes closed. The documentation was in a folder she kept in the inner pocket of her institutional uniform, the specific location she had chosen because uniform pockets were never searched. Because low-ranked Omegas assigned to linen inventory were not considered interesting enough to search. The folder contained 14 weeks of carefully organized dream witness accounts, cross-referenced and dated, covering 23 individuals whose dream content she had been systematically navigating since she had first stumbled into the conspiracy's dream space 8 weeks ago and understood what she was seeing. She had submitted the documentation 6 times through 6 different channels. The first submission had gone to her departmental supervisor, who had referred her to the Palace Guard Administration with the specific efficiency of someone resolving a routing problem rather than a security concern. The Palace Guard Administration had processed her submission in 3 days and had informed her, through the standard response system, that her report fell outside their administrative jurisdiction because it concerned internal court personnel rather than external threats. The council's internal oversight function had taken 7 days and had determined that dream accounts were not admissible evidence under their evidentiary standards and recommended she consult the Palace Welfare Office for her sleep-related distress. The Senior Administrative Scheduling Office had received her hand-delivered submission and had given her the specific look of a person deciding something quickly and had filed it in a location from which she had never received a response. The palace physician had reframed her submission as a medical disclosure about anxiety-driven dream amplification and had not forwarded it to any governance function. The general petition process had given her a 14-day review window. The 14th day was 11 days away. She sat in the linen alcove with the receipt confirmation in her hands and the specific arithmetic of the situation arranged clearly in her mind. 11 days. A conspiracy whose dream content had shifted in the past week into the specific quality she had learned to identify as finalization, and 0 viable paths remaining through official channels. She needed a different approach. She needed someone who would listen. She thought about who in this palace she trusted not based on their waking behavior, which she understood as well as any palace worker, and considerably less well than the people whose positions gave them visibility into it, but based on their dream content. The one category of assessment where she had 21 years of experience and near-perfect accuracy. She thought about the king's personal guard. The gift had never asked her permission. It had arrived at 7 years old with the specific abruptness of something that had always been present becoming suddenly active. She had fallen asleep beside her younger brother during his fever and had found herself walking through a landscape that was both the room she had been sitting in and something larger and stranger than the room. A space that had the room's geometry, but the specific emotional texture of her brother's sleeping mind overlaid on it. The fever's heat visible as a quality of the light. The fear of the dream visible as a pressure at the periphery that moved whenever she looked directly at it. She had woken and found the fever breaking. She had not connected these two things for 3 more years, had not understood that her presence in the dream space had done something to the fever's dream architecture, had calmed the fear pressure, had produced in her brother's dreaming mind the specific quality of being accompanied rather than alone in the fear. She had simply known from that morning that when she closed her eyes, she went somewhere that other people also were, and that she was not always in her own somewhere. The navigation had been the first skill she developed, because the gift was directional in a way that needed managing. Without navigation, she simply went to whoever was generating the most intense dream content in her proximity, which in a shared household was frequently her mother's exhausting anxiety dreams, or her father's recurring professional catastrophe scenarios, or her brother's vivid adventure dreams that she had eventually learned to find restful as a change from the others. With navigation developed over years of practice, through the specific patient attention of someone who had no teacher for what she was learning and was working out the rules from first principles, she could follow different threads. She could choose the direction of a specific emotional quality and move toward it rather than simply receiving the nearest dream. The navigation was not perfect. It was sensitive to proximity and to the intensity of the dream content she was moving toward. From the linen alcove, she could reliably navigate to the kitchen wing, the administrative east corridor, and the adjacent residential section. The conspiracy's dreams were in the eastern residential wing, the section where court members with small apartments were housed. The section she could reach from the alcove with effort. The section where she had followed an unusual thread of anxious urgency 8 weeks ago and found herself in the dream space of a junior counsel aide who was processing something that his waking mind required him to conceal. To demonstrate what she had, there was a woman in the palace's east wing whose dreams she walked 3 times a week because the woman's dream content was the most vivid and specific she had encountered outside the conspiracy. The woman was the head of the palace's textile purchasing office. Her dreams were detailed economic anxieties, the specific fears of a woman who knew exactly how much things cost and spent considerable dream time working through supply chain scenarios. She dreamed in numbers and in cloth samples and in the faces of suppliers she had been negotiating with for years. Her dreams had no political content whatsoever. The difference between her dreams and the conspiracy's dreams was architecturally visible. The textile officer's dreams were the dreams of someone managing the gap between what they needed and what was available, diffuse, branching, returning to the same concerns from different angles because the concerns had no single resolution point. The conspiracy's dreams were the dreams of people managing the gap between what they had planned and what they had not yet executed, focused, specific, returning to particular concrete details because those details required confirmation, because the plan depended on them being correct. She had documented the distinction in the folder. She had documented everything in the folder. She had been documentation precisely because she understood the evidentiary limitation that no channel would accept dream accounts as primary evidence, that the only path to credibility ran through the dream testimony being proven accurate by subsequent physical events. She had been building the documentation for when that proof arrived. She had been hoping to deliver the information before the proof was necessary. The hope had been running out for 6 weeks. The first time she had understood that she was not going to be heard, she had been sitting in the palace guard administration's waiting area on the 3rd morning of the submission process, watching the administrative staff process requests with the efficient neutrality of people who had learned to sort information by category rather than by urgency, and she had recognized, in the specific quality of the way the receiving officer had taken her written submission and placed it in the in-tray without reading the first page, that what was about to happen was not a processing failure. It was a routing success. The submission was going to be processed exactly as the system was designed to process it, and the system was designed to route submissions from low-ranked palace workers to administrative levels that corresponded to their rank rather than to the urgency or accuracy of their content. She had sat in the waiting area and had felt, for the first time in the submission process, the specific variety of wait that was not despair implied a belief that things could have been otherwise, and she had not quite had that belief but was adjacent to it, the weight of accurate information that had no available path. She had submitted anyway. She had submitted 6 times because submitting was the correct, procedurally accountable thing to do, and because the record of the submissions was itself evidence that the governance structure had received the information and had not acted on it. Evidence that would matter when the proof arrived if she could not prevent the proof from arriving. The conspiracy's urgency in the dream space had escalated in direct proportion to her failing submissions. In the first weeks, the conspirators' dreams had been processing logistics, the specific dream content of people working through the operational details of a plan, confirming the elements, running through the timing. In the 4th week, the dream content had shifted to the quality she identified as final preparation, the tighter, more pressured processing of minds that had moved from contingency to commitment. In the 6th week, the most recent week, the content had the specific quality she had seen before in the dreams of people facing irreversible action, the compression, the narrowing of focus, the specific reduction of dream detail to only the elements that were going to happen very soon. She had 3 nights. The most recent dismissal had been from the general petition process, not the petition itself, which was still technically under review, but the specific experience of submitting the 7th variation of her documentation and receiving the receipt confirmation and the 14-day review window and understanding in the moment of receiving it. That 14 days was a kind of cruelty the system did not know it was performing. She sat in the linen alcove the day after the receipt confirmation with the folder in her hands and thought about who in this palace she trusted. The king's personal guard, Oren. She had walked his dreams twice, not in the conspiracy's direction. In the direction of the western corridor, where the guard quarters were. On 2 nights, when the emotional intensity there had been high enough to pull her navigation. His dreams were not the dreams of a man with private agendas. They were the dreams of a man whose entire professional identity had been built around a single decision made a long time ago, and who did not revisit the decision because the decision was what he was. His loyalty was structural, not performed, not contingent, not the loyalty of someone who had calculated that loyalty was in their interest. The dreams of someone whose loyalty was structural had a specific quality she had learned to identify over 21 years. They were simple. They did not require the complex dream architecture of people managing the gap between their expressed and actual commitments. Oren would receive what she brought him. The question was whether receiving it would be enough to produce action in the time she had. She did not have a better option. She put the folder in her inner pocket and went to find him during the guard rotation change. The conspiracy had 23 members, and she had walked 14 of their dreams over 8 weeks. Not all of them dreamed with the same specificity. Some processed in symbolic fragments that required interpretation. Some ran the same anxiety scenarios repeatedly without developing new information. Some had dream content that was dense and useful, and some that was thin and ambient. But the 14 she had navigated consistently had given her the complete architecture of the plan. And in the past 7 days the architecture had been compressing toward a single point. Tonight was the most vivid she had seen from the aide whose anxiety dreams had first led her to the conspiracy. He was the youngest of the 23 and the most frightened, and his fear made his dreams the most consistently specific, the frightened mind processing contingencies in vivid detail, returning again and again to the same elements because the fear required confirmation of the plan rather than escape from it. She had walked his dream for 30 minutes before dawn. The date was in it. Not announced, the aide's dream did not produce calendar dates, but the timeline was present in the dream's texture. The specific compression of a mind that knew it was within 72 hours of the thing it had been building toward for months. She had felt the compression as a quality of the dream space, the way the air in a room felt. Different when a storm was approaching from a direction you could not see yet, but your body registered before your eyes did. She had woken and written it down. She had also, that same morning, made her 7th submission, the formal documentation to the general petition process, which she knew would not function in time, but which she had submitted because the record of the submission mattered, and because she was the kind of person who did the procedurally accountable thing, even when she knew the procedure was going to fail her. The receipt confirmation had arrived by midday. 14-day review window. She sat in the linen alcove in the afternoon with the receipt in one hand and the folder in the other, and felt the specific quality of someone who has exhausted the options that were available and is now assessing the options that are not available. The not available option was Oren. Not unavailable because he could not be accessed. She had identified the rotation window during which the western corridor was staffed by fewer personnel, had mapped it from the conspiracy's dream content with the obsessive detail of minds that had spent months looking for gaps in the palace's security rhythm. Unavailable in the sense that approaching the king's personal guard with a security briefing was not a thing a linen inventory omega did in the normal course of palace operations, and doing it required a specific quality of approach that would either work very quickly or not at all. She had been preparing the approach for 2 days. That evening, during the rotation window, she found Oren in the western corridor and said his name in the voice she used when she needed to be heard rather than managed. He stopped. She said, "I have a security matter concerning the king. I have 3 nights." He looked at her for a specific 3 seconds. He said, "Come with me." Oren took her to the guardroom adjacent to the king's private corridor, and he sat across from her, and he gave her the full quality of his attention without performing it, which was the first time in 6 weeks that anyone had done this. She told him in the order she had determined was most likely to be received: outcome first, evidence second, method third. She had learned in 6 weeks of being dismissed that leading with the dream walking was the fastest path to dismissal. The mechanics were unusual enough to function as a category override, sending the listener's assessment into the territory of unreliable before the content could register. So she began with what she knew, documented and specific, and she presented the evidence with the patient thoroughness of someone who had been organizing it for 8 weeks for exactly this conversation. And she presented the method third, because by the 3rd point the evidence was already in the listener's hands. She spread the folder's contents on the table. 23 names, each participant's role, the dream content from each of the 14 she had navigated, cross-referenced with the other participants' accounts to show the internal consistency of the plan's architecture. The timeline, the entry point, the corridor, the method, the inside participant's name. She told him about the dream walking, what it was, how it activated, why she was always drowsy, why she had been able to document this at the level of detail in front of him. Oren received the information the way a man with structural loyalty received things, directly, without the defensive architecture of someone managing their response to what they were hearing. He asked 2 questions during the presentation, not questions designed to challenge the information's credibility. Questions designed to complete his understanding of specific operational details. The questions were good. They were the questions of someone who was already thinking about what action the information required. When she finished, he said, "The inside participant." She said, "Yes." He said, "They have corridor access on the night watch rotation." She said, "On the relevant nights, yes." He said, "Which night?" She said, 3 nights from now at the outside. Possibly 2. The dream content suggests 72 hours or less. He picked up the documentation and read it with the specific attention of someone who was reading for action rather than reading for assessment. She waited. She had learned over 21 years of carrying information that people were not expecting to receive. That the quality of the waiting mattered, that performing patience was different from actually having it, and that the people who received difficult information well could distinguish between the two. He looked up from the last page. He said, "You submitted this 6 times." She said, "Yes." He said, "None of it reached the king." She said, "None of it reached anyone with the authority or the will to act on it." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you understand why I came to you?" He said, "Because you read people's dreams and you have been reading mine." She said twice. She said, "You do not have a complicated internal life, which is a compliment in this context." Something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. He said, "I am going to act on this tonight." She said, "Yes." He said, "You will not be able to come with me." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you trust me to do what needs to be done with it?" She looked at him. She said, "Yes." She said, "More than anyone else in this palace." He held the documentation for a moment, and then he stood and he went. She sat alone in the guardroom and felt the specific quality of someone who had handed the only thing they had to someone they trusted, and was now in the specific vulnerability of having nothing left to do but wait. She did not sleep. Her body needed sleep with the specific insistence of something that had been running continuously for weeks without the rest it required. But the night was one of those nights when sleep would not arrive because the waking world was producing too much of its own urgency for the dream space to compete. She lay in the linen alcove and stared at the alcove's ceiling and thought about the timeline and about Oren and about the specific quality of trust that required transferring your only remaining option into another person's hands. At the second bell of the night watch, she heard movement in the eastern corridor. She rose. She knew the corridor geometry. She knew the specific position from which the relevant door was partially visible if she stood at the alcove's entrance at the correct angle. She had mapped this position months ago, before she had found the conspiracy, simply because knowing her environment's visual field was the habit of someone who spent their waking hours navigating spaces where her presence was tolerated rather than invited. She stood at the alcove's entrance and watched. The inside participant reached the corridor door with the specific body language of someone executing a plan. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. Controlled, deliberate. The absence of the hesitation that marked everything a person did when their conscience was engaged. She watched the participant's hand reach the lock and find it secured in a configuration the participant had not expected, not locked in the standard manner, but secured additionally, in the specific way that communicated to anyone who knew what they were looking at that someone had been here first. The participant's face did the thing faces did when a plan met an obstacle. She heard voices from the adjacent corridor, then rapid movement. Then the specific organized quality of the palace guard response, not routine, directed. Oren had acted. Whatever preparation he had made in the hours since she had given him the documentation had been sufficient to redirect the attempt's mechanism without triggering a confrontation. The attempt failed. It failed not because it had been heroically stopped, but because one small element of its architecture had been quietly altered. The plan had required the corridor lock to be in a specific configuration. The lock was in a different configuration. The plan's precision was its vulnerability. She stood at the alcove's entrance and watched the aftermath develop in the corridor the participant detained. The guards moving with the purpose of people who had been briefed. The specific quality of a crisis being contained rather than erupting. She had described this. She had described all of it in specific detail 6 weeks ago, and again 5 weeks ago, and again 4 weeks ago, and 3 times after that, and once this morning through the general petition process, which had a 14-day review window. The corridor was bright now with extra lamps. She heard Oren's voice giving instructions to the guards in the specific calm authority of someone who had known this was coming and had prepared for it. She heard him give the instructions, and then she heard him say, in a different register quieter, directed at a specific location, her name. She stepped into the corridor. He was looking at her from 20 feet away with the expression of a man who had done what he said he was going to do, and wanted the person he had made a promise to know it. He said, "The king wants to see you." The council chamber had 7 people in it. Kale was standing at the head of the table with the document from 6 weeks ago in front of him. And he was not in the performing stance of a king receiving a report. He was in the specific posture of a man who had been handed something that required him to revise a significant number of prior assumptions, and was in the middle of that revision. The document was open. There was another document beside it, the guard captain's incident report from the corridor, placed in direct comparison with hers by someone who wanted the comparison to be visible. She stood at the chamber entrance, and the 7 people in the chamber looked at her. The quality of being seen by 7 people simultaneously, as a person who had spent 11 months being systematically invisible, was something she had thought about in the abstract but had not experienced. She found it was not what she had expected. She had expected to find it uncomfortable. Instead, she found it was simply what it was, a specific moment that had arrived after a long sequence of moments that had been building toward it, with no particular emotional register except presence. Kale said her name. He said it the way you said someone's name when you had been saying it internally for a short time, and the internal version had not yet been displaced by direct experience. It had the quality of someone locating a word for the first time after thinking around the concept for hours. She said, "Yes." He said, "Come in." She came in. She sat where he indicated the working seat, not the position at the table's far end that communicated interrogation. The working position that communicated something about the quality of conversation he was intending. He said, "The document on the table." She said, "Yes." He said, "You submitted it 6 weeks ago through the general petition process." She said, "That was the 7th submission. The previous 6 went through departmental supervision, Palace Guard Administration, Council Internal Oversight, Senior Administrative Scheduling, the Palace Physician, and the third-level administrative review process I found in the Governance Manual's appendix. She said it with the neutral precision of someone providing accurate information. The room was quiet with a specific quality. He said, "None of them reached me." She said, "No." He said, "How did you know what was going to happen?" She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full quality of his attention, not the managed attention of a king processing a subject's account. Not the performed listening of a governance professional receiving a report from a low-ranked witness. The direct, unguarded attention of a man who had just encountered something significant that he did not yet understand and was trying to understand it as quickly and accurately as his intelligence permitted. She thought, this is what the absence of the filtering architecture feels like. The hierarchy had been keeping her out of this room for 6 weeks. And the thing the hierarchy had been protecting him from was exactly this. Information delivered without the mediation of rank. She said, "I walk through other people's dreams while I sleep." She said it in the voice she used for accurate information, direct, without apology or performance. He did not dismiss it. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Explain what that means." She told him the mechanics first. She told him about the involuntary activation, the body that never rested because the mind was working during sleep, the accumulated cost of 21 years of the gift running continuously. She told him about the navigation skill, how she had developed it over 2 decades from first principles, with no teacher, through the specific patient iteration of someone learning a complex skill alone. She told him the gift's direction logic, the emotional proximity principle, the way she had learned to follow specific threads, to navigate toward the content that was urgent rather than simply the content that was nearest. She told him what it felt like from inside, not poetically practically, with the specific vocabulary she had developed over 21 years of being the only person she knew who had this experience. The vocabulary she had built from scratch because no existing vocabulary was adequate. She told him about the distinction between symbolic dream content and concrete dream content, between the diffuse anxiety processing of minds that were managing ongoing stress and the specific vivid processing of minds that were working through concrete plans. He listened. He listened with the quality of someone who was building a model of what he was hearing in real time, asking himself what questions would complete the model, and asking those questions rather than the questions of someone managing their response to information they had already decided to disbelieve. He said, "The inside participant, the person who left the lock unaltered." She said, "I walked their dreams 3 weeks ago when the content shifted from planning to final preparation. The specific detail of the lock configuration was in the dream content twice over 4 nights." He said, "They were dreaming about the lock." She said, "They were dreaming about everything." She said, "The frightened mind works very thoroughly." She said, "He is the youngest of the 23 and the most afraid, which made his dreams the most detailed." He said, 23. She said, "Yes. The full list is in the documentation." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "I understand that dream testimony is not conventional evidence." She said, "I have been aware of this limitation since the beginning." She said, "I tried to deliver the information early enough to allow conventional verification, and the channels did not transmit it in the available time." She said, The only evidence that was going to produce institutional acknowledgement of what I was carrying was a physical event that confirmed the dream content, which is exactly what happened tonight, and which is exactly the failure of the governance structure I was trying to work within. He looked at her. She said, "I am not saying this as a complaint. I am saying it so you understand the full shape of what tonight proves." He said, "It proves that what you described was accurate." She said, "Yes." He said, "Which means the 6 weeks of submissions." She said, "Which means the 6 weeks of submissions were 6 weeks of accurate intelligence that your court's architecture routed away from your attention." She said it plainly. She said, "I am going to show you the submission history." He said, "Show me." They spent 4 hours with the documentation. She had organized it for this conversation not chronologically, not by submission date, but by the specific architecture of the failure, what each channel had done with her submission, where it had gone, what administrative logic had produced the routing decision. She presented it the way she presented everything that mattered, with the patient thoroughness of someone who had been preparing to deliver this to someone who could receive it and was not going to compress it now that the person was finally in front of her. He read. He asked questions. The questions were the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the full structure rather than assessing the evidence's credibility. He said, the second submission, the Palace Guard Administration. She said, yes. He said, the response routes you to the Council's internal oversight. She said, yes. He said, 3 of the 23 conspirators are in the Council's administrative staff. She said, yes. He said, and the 4th submission, the Senior Administrative Scheduling Office. She said, yes. She said, the person who manages your scheduling is affiliated with 2 of the 23 conspirators through a professional relationship that produces a shared interest in controlling information flow to your attention. She said, I found this in their dream content. The affiliation is not necessarily deliberate complicity with the conspiracy, it is the specific accumulation of a relationship with people whose interests align against your receiving certain categories of information. He said, for how long? She said, at minimum the 11 months I have been here. She said, the dream content I have seen suggests the information management pattern predates my arrival by several years. He was quiet for a long time. She waited. He said, I built this court. He said it with the specific quality of a statement that was also an acknowledgement, not looking for absolution, locating the thing that required accountability. She said, yes. He said, I built it to be efficient. She said, yes. She said, it is efficient. She said, it is also very effective at preventing the king from receiving information that the court's administrative layer finds inconvenient. He said, they were not deciding to filter my information. She said, the system was filtering your information. The individuals were operating within a system they had not designed. She said, this distinction matters for the accountability, but it does not change what the system produced. He said, what did it produce? She said, 6 weeks of ignored intelligence about an assassination conspiracy. She said, 17 people in your administrative hierarchy who received accurate security information and processed it according to rank rather than urgency. She said, a linen inventory omega who submitted 7 reports in 6 weeks and exhausted every available channel and then bypassed the channels entirely because she had no other option. She said, and a king who is alive tonight not because his governance system worked, but because his governance system failed to prevent one person from doing something the system was not designed to accommodate. He looked at the table. He said, "I am going to address the structure." She said, "Yes." She said, "We can discuss what that should look like after we have addressed the people in the documentation." He said, "The conspirators." She said, "The full list is on the 3rd page of the folder." She said, "I recommend Oren be the one who acts on it." She said, "His dream content is the specific content of someone who will not be managed by political considerations in this process." He looked at her when she said that. She said, "I have walked his dreams twice." She said, "He is not complicated." He said after a moment, "How often do you walk my dreams?" She said, 3 times in 11 months. She said, "I follow the most emotionally intense thread available when I navigate toward the eastern wing, and twice the intensity there was yours." He said, "And what did you find?" She said, "Someone who finds the weight of governance heavy and is not pretending otherwise when no one is watching." She said, "Someone who is trying, in their sleep, to see something that the architecture of their waking life keeps blocking from view." The chamber was very quiet. He said, "Was it my court?" She said, "I believe so." She said, "The recurring image in your dreams is a room with many people in it, and something important that you cannot see because of where the room places you relative to everyone else." He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, the attention she had walked through his dreams and recognized as its truest version, the version that existed below the governance and the weight of what he carried. He said, "I want to address the structure." She said, "Yes." She said, "But first tell me what you're going to do about tonight." The formal challenge arrived on the 3rd day. She had been expecting it, because she had navigated toward the conspirators' dreams in the 2 nights following the attempt's failure, and had found exactly what she expected to find. The specific dream content of people who had moved from planning to damage control, whose minds were processing the pivot from an executed plan to a survival plan with the same vivid specificity they had brought to the original design. The challenge was submitted to the council by 3 senior nobles' names in her documentation. Names she had not been surprised to see associated with the formal legal process, because the formal legal process was the channel the surviving conspirators could still access. It argued for positions in careful, procedurally impeccable language. That the failed attempt had been staged a performance designed to advance the standing of a low-ranked palace worker with undisclosed ambitions, using access to information about the king's routine that any observant palace worker could accumulate through 11 months of proximity. That the document submitted 6 weeks earlier was not genuine predictive testimony, but a fabricated account produced in advance to create the appearance of prior knowledge about an event the author had in fact participated in planning. That dream-walking testimony was not admissible under any recognized evidentiary standard. That presenting it as predictive intelligence was a deliberate deception, and that the king's willingness to receive such testimony indicated he was being manipulated by someone who had engineered access to his attention. That the appropriate remedy was Neva's immediate removal from the palace and formal investigation of her involvement in the conspiracy she claimed to have documented. She read the challenge in Cale's working room. He had given her access to his working room 2 days ago, which was itself a kind of statement that had not been missed by the people who track such things. She read it carefully, with the attention she gave to all documents that required accurate assessment. She said, "The fourth argument." He said, "It frames you as a conspirator." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is the only argument that does not require the first three to be believed." She said, "A court that is uncertain about dream walking as evidence can still be uncertain about whether I was a participant rather than a witness." She said, "Uncertainty in that direction is sufficient to prevent action on the documentation." He said, "What is the counter?" She said, "The counter is what the attempt's failure already demonstrated." She said, "If I had staged the attempt, I would have needed to know every operational detail in advance, which means either I was one of the 23, which the documentation establishes I was not, or I had independent access to the planning, which is what the dream walking provides." She said, "The challenge requires you to believe that I fabricated a 6-week predictive account of a conspiracy I was not part of with enough operational detail to confirm in advance with the inside participant's exact role and the specific corridor configuration." She said, "The Occam's razor here is not complicated." He said, "I know." He said, "But the challenge's purpose is not to succeed in the formal proceeding. Its purpose is to delay." She said, "Yes." He said, "Delay long enough for the secondary plan to produce results." She said, "They have been processing a secondary plan in their dreams for 2 nights." She said, "I need to sleep tonight near the eastern residential wing." He said, "I will arrange a room." She said, "The challenge also does something else." She said, "It is publicly visible." She said, "The court's political environment now contains the formal proposition that I staged an assassination attempt on the king I was trying to protect." She said, "Everyone in this palace who has been watching what has happened in the past 3 days has received that proposition alongside everything else." He said, "You have been doing the work of managing the court's political environment through formal proceedings before." She said, "I have been doing linen inventory." He said, "You know what I mean." She said, "I know." She said, "I am telling you that the court's political environment is not something I have the standing to manage." She said, "I am telling you this is your domain, not mine." He said, "And you are telling me what you see in it." She said, "I am telling you what I see in it." She said, "What you do with it is your work." He looked at her with the quality she had been cataloging for 3 days, the quality she recognized from his dreams as the truest version of him, the one that was trying to see past the architecture of his own governance. He said, "I will prepare a response to the challenge." She said, "I know." She said, "Tonight I need to sleep." She paused at the door. She said, "The response to the challenge should include a public statement about the 6 weeks of submissions." She said, "Not as a complaint, as a factual account of what the governance structure produced." She said, "The court needs to know the shape of the failure before it can assess the appropriate shape of the response." He said, "Yes." She went to sleep in the room he had arranged, closer to the eastern residential wing than the linen alcove, and her mind went where it always went. The dreams were very clear. The specific quality of minds that had moved past the crisis phase and into the acute strategy phase. Not the compressed urgency of final preparation, but the specific focused processing of people who had switched from one plan to a second plan with the experienced efficiency of people who had contingency structures. The challenge had been the public-facing move. The second move was documentary. She navigated through the first conspirator's dream and found the architecture of the fabrication. The specific documents that needed to be produced, the appearance of origin they needed to carry, the two external contacts who were going to provide the apparent evidentiary foundation. The dream was processing the logistics with the specific attention of a dreaming mind that was working through something that required getting details exactly right. She stayed with the first dream for 20 minutes and collected everything. She navigated to the second conspirator's dream and found the timeline. The fabricated evidence was going to be introduced through the challenge's discovery process, which under the council's procedural rules had a 5-day window. 5 days was sufficient time to produce the documentation they needed if the external contacts were cooperative, which the first dream's content suggested they would be. She stayed with the second dream for 15 minutes. She navigated to the third, the senior noble whose dream content was the most strategically detailed, and found the element she had not known to look for: a name. Not a conspirator's name, not a fabricator's name. The name of the council member who was going to receive the fabricated documentation and process it through the discovery track. A council member whose name she had not seen in the conspiracy's planning content before, which meant this was a new alliance rather than an existing one, which meant the challenge's political network was larger than the original 23. She woke at the fourth bell and wrote everything down. She wrote it in the specific organized manner of someone who had been doing this for 8 weeks and had the documentation practice deeply embedded, each piece of content dated, attributed to the specific dream, cross-referenced with any prior content from the same source. She had the full picture by the time the palace was beginning its morning preparations. She sat with the documentation in the arranged room and thought about what she had. She thought, the secondary plan requires 5 days. She thought, the formal challenge's discovery process requires 5 days. She thought, 5 days is sufficient time to prevent the fabrication from being produced if the people producing it are known in advance. She thought, going through official channels is not going to work in 5 days. She thought, I need to go public. She was already composing the structure of the full court presentation by the time she went to find Kale. She said, I am ready to speak to the full court. He said, today? She said, today. She said, the secondary plan has a 5-day window and the 5 days start now. He said, the full court is formal process. She said, yes. She said, I am aware of that. She said, I have been operating outside formal process for 6 weeks and outside it for 3 days more, and I am not asking to circumvent the formal process. She said, I am asking to use it. He said, you will be speaking in front of everyone who dismissed you. She said, yes. He said, and everyone who is trying to remove you. She said, yes. She said, I have everything I need to say. She said, I have been preparing it for 6 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment with the quality that she had come to understand in the past 3 days was what genuine attention felt like from the receiving and not managed. Not performed, the specific warmth of being seen by someone who was choosing to look. He said, then we convene the full court this afternoon. The full court session had been convened in the main chamber with the specific formal apparatus that made it the highest level of palace governance. All council members present, all senior administrators, all formal witnesses to the proceedings. The chamber had 54 people in it. She had counted them because counting was what she did in unfamiliar spaces. She stood at the working position, not the address podium, the working table's presenter position, the position that communicated function rather than performance. She had chosen this deliberately. She presented the conspiracy's documentation in the order she had organized it for maximum structural clarity. The full participant list with each person's role and the dream content that established it. The cross-references between 14 separate dreaming minds, showing the shared plan's consistency. The operational details confirmed by the inside participant's post-attempt account. She presented the submission history, 7 submissions, 7 channels, 7 failures, specific dates, specific responses, specific administrative personnel who had received and not transmitted. She named the channels. She named the administrative staff members who had received her submissions. She said, 3 of the individuals who processed my submissions and did not transmit them are on the conspiracy's participant list. She said it with the same neutrality she used for all accurate information. She said, I am not asserting that this represents deliberate obstruction in every case. I am asserting that it represents the specific failure condition of a governance system that routes security information through the administrative layer, most likely to contain the security concern being reported. She presented the secondary plan. She described it in the same terms she had described everything else, specific, source to specific dream content documented that morning, cross-referenced with the challenge's formal structure to show the specific mechanism by which the fabricated evidence was going to be introduced. She named the council member who had been identified in the third conspirator's dream as the recipient for the fabricated documentation. The chamber was very quiet. The challenge's lead noble said, the admissibility of dream testimony. She said, the document submitted 6 weeks ago described the attempt in complete operational detail. She said, the attempt occurred exactly as described. She said, if the court is prepared to attribute this to coincidence, I would ask that the court explain the specific mechanism by which a linen inventory Omega with no intelligence connections produced a 6-week advance account of an assassination conspiracy that proved operationally accurate in every particular. She said, I am not asking for dream testimony to be accepted without scrutiny. I am asking the court to account for what the attempt's failure already established. The legal proceedings were opened within the hour. The inside participant had been in custody since the night of the attempt and had provided, in Oren's preliminary interview, a detailed account of the conspiracy's structure that confirmed Neva's documentation in every operational particular. Not because she had been present at the interview, she had not, but because Oren had asked the specific questions that the documentation had equipped him to ask. And the inside participant had confirmed specific details that no one outside the conspiracy could have known without direct access to the planning content. Every confirmed detail was in her documentation. The secondary plan had been intercepted before introduction. Oren had moved on the external contacts that morning based on the documentation she had produced before dawn. The contacts had been located before the fabricated documents were produced. The fabrication plan had been named in open court before it was deployed. The council member identified as the intended recipient had been informed in the chamber itself. In front of the full court, which was not where anyone wanted to receive that information. The challenge's formal legal foundation, the argument that required the fabricated evidence to be introduced to work, had been removed. The challenge's lead noble said, in the specific register of someone who had watched their primary and secondary strategies both fail in the same session. The proceedings are being conducted under conditions of undue influence by the king's personal guard. Kale said, the proceedings are being conducted under conditions of complete documentation. He said it from the working table, where he had been sitting since the session began, not the throne. The working table, the position he had chosen that communicated what kind of session this was. He said, the documentation was produced by the same source who produced the 6-week advance account of the assassination attempt. He said, the council will assess the documentation's content on its merits. The council member, who had been identified in the third conspirator's dream as the intended recipient of the fabricated evidence, was very still. Cale said, I want the council to note that the individual I just mentioned was named in this morning's documentation before this session began, and that this morning's documentation was produced from dream content witnessed last night, and that this session is happening because someone with no access to any official intelligence channel spent 8 weeks walking through the dreams of 23 conspirators and documenting what she found, and 6 weeks trying to deliver that documentation through a governance structure that was not designed to receive it from someone like her. The chamber was quiet with the specific quality of a very large group of people understanding that they were in the presence of something significant. 14 conspirators were formally charged before the session concluded. 9 more were placed on administrative hold pending investigation. The challenge was withdrawn. Cale called the formal reckoning session on the 5th day. Not the council, the full palace assembly, the formal gathering that was reserved for announcements of the highest governance significance. He stood at the assembly's center on the floor, not the raised position, and he did not use any of the formal apparatus of a king making an authoritative statement. He stood on the floor because what he was about to say did not benefit from elevation. He said, 11 months ago a low-ranked Omega was assigned to linen inventory because the palace's administrative system had determined she was not functional for more demanding duties. He said, the determination was based on her drowsiness. He said, her drowsiness was the cost of a gift that was reading this palace's hidden reality every night and has been reading it for her entire adult life. He said, 8 weeks ago she identified an assassination conspiracy through that gift and documented it with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that her evidence would not be received without extensive corroborating documentation. He said, she submitted the documentation 7 times over 6 weeks through 7 different channels. He said, none of the submissions reached me. He said, 3 of the 7 channels routed her submissions back through administrative levels that contained members of the conspiracy she was reporting on. He said, the other 4 channels routed her submissions through the rank-based hierarchy that my court uses to manage information flow, which was functioning exactly as designed, and in doing so ensured that accurate intelligence about an assassination conspiracy produced by someone without rank could not reach someone with the authority to act on it. He said, I built this court. He said, I maintained this information architecture for 6 years. He said, the attempt occurred exactly as she described. He said, I am alive tonight not because my governance system protected me, but because one person found a way around it. He said, the governance structure is going to change. He said, Neva's name and her 6 weeks of submissions will be entered into the permanent administrative record as the specific case study that documented the failure. He said, this is not a complaint. It is the most useful form the failure's documentation can take, visible, specific, accessible to future administrations as evidence of what happens when the information architecture prioritizes rank over accuracy. The assembly was quiet with the silence of people receiving something true that was also costly. She stood at the assembly's edge, and received the accounting with the composure of someone who had needed this for 6 weeks and was not performing gratitude for it. She received it as what it was. The most honest thing she had heard an authority figure say about something she had experienced. She held its weight and acknowledged it without releasing the full accounting it represented. She thought, this is the beginning, not the end. She met with Cale the following morning with a list. She had been constructing the list in the margins of her documentation for 6 weeks, not a complaint list, not a demand list. The specific organized account of what the governance structure needed to look like for the failure to not occur again. She had been building it as a parallel track to the submission process. What to submit to the channels that would not receive it, and what to propose if she ever found herself in the room where the proposals could be received. She was in the room. She said, the Dreamwalkers Council. She described it, an independent body with constitutionally established direct access to the king's attention, bypassing the rank-based routing hierarchy for any submission categorized as security-related, with the authority to present information in formal council sessions regardless of the presenter's rank. Staffed initially by herself and any other practitioners that a public inquiry produced, with the evidentiary standards she had developed for dream witness testimony built into its charter. She said, the hierarchy audit, the specific routing logic that had produced the 7 failed submissions mapped, named, and revised to eliminate the points of failure where rank-based filtering was most likely to prevent urgency-based transmission. She said, the formal recognition of dreamwalking testimony as admissible evidence subject to verification requirements cross-reference with at least one corroborating non-dream source. Contemporaneous documentation rather than retrospective account. Not accepted without scrutiny. Accepted as a category rather than dismissed as one. She said, the permanent administrative record of the 6 submissions, as he had already committed to in the public session. She said, and a 5th item. He said, I thought there were 4. She said, there are 5. She said it with the first imprecision she had allowed herself in 6 weeks of very careful language. The specific small deliberate looseness of someone who had earned the right to it. He said, tell me. She said, I would like to not work in linen inventory anymore. He said, I have a position in mind. She said, I know. She said, I walked your dream 3 nights ago. She said, you were at the council table with an empty chair and you were working out how to fill it. He looked at her. She said, the chair was at the working table. She said, I recognized it from the proceedings. He said, and what do you think of the candidate? She said, the candidate has reservations. She said, the position is being created in response to a crisis that nearly killed you, which is not the ideal origin for a governance function. She said, she would prefer the position had always existed. He said, the position should have always existed. She said, yes. He said, does the candidate have other reservations? She said, the candidate has been watching your dreams for 11 months. She said, this is either a significant qualification or a significant problem for the position, depending on how you frame it. He said, I am inclined toward qualification. She said, I know. She said, I have documentation. He almost smiled the specific version of it she had seen in his dreams and recognized as the one that was real. He said, all 5 requirements. He said it without negotiation, which was the correct response, and which she had assessed as likely from the quality of the past 6 days. She said, good. She said, "When do we start?" The Dreamwalkers Council was established 6 weeks after the public session. She had written the charter herself, the most precise governance document she had produced in 11 months of palace residency. Built from 21 years of understanding her gift's mechanics and 6 weeks of understanding what happened when those mechanics were not given an institutional home. She had drafted the evidentiary standards with the specific care of someone who knew both the gift's accuracy and its limitations, who wanted the standards to be rigorous enough to be credible and realistic enough to be functional. The public inquiry for additional practitioners had been her suggestion. She had understood, from her own experience, that people carrying this gift were unlikely to present themselves as practitioners. They were more likely to present as people with sleep disorders, as people with chronic fatigue, as people who were considered unreliable for demanding positions. The inquiry had described the gift's characteristics and asked anyone who recognized them to come forward. 43 people had responded. 38 had sleep conditions without informational gifts. 5 had variants of dream walking at different depths and with different properties. 3 of those 5 were now on the council. The hierarchy audit had produced 61 specific routing changes, the points in the administrative structure where rank-based filtering had been consistently overriding urgency-based transmission. Some of the changes were small. A reclassification that prevented security submissions from being routed through non-security departments. Some were structural. The creation of a direct submission track for individuals below a certain rank threshold who were reporting concerns about individuals above that threshold. The 61 changes collectively represented the specific correction of a governance architecture that had been producing the outcome of the past 11 months. Cale had read the audit report himself. She had not asked him to do this. He had done it because reading things himself rather than receiving summaries was a practice he was developing, which she knew because he had told her directly, and which she also knew because his dream content showed a mind that was developing new habits of attention. She found herself in his dreams more often now. This was not entirely unexpected. People whose dream content had been significantly affected by a real-world event processed the event repeatedly in the weeks and months following, working through its implications with the specific thoroughness of minds that needed to integrate something that had required significant revision of prior assumptions. She navigated away from his dreams when she could, because the specific ethical architecture of her gift required her to limit her witnessing of people who knew she was watching, who had consented to her awareness in general, but had not consented to specific content. She told him this. He said, "You are managing the ethics of your gift in real time." She said, "I have been managing them for 21 years. She said, "The management is different now because before no one knew I was watching, and now at least one person does." He said, "Does it change what you see?" She said, "It changes the quality of the seeing." She said, "There is a different register in the dreams of people who are aware of being witnessed." She said, "Yours have it." He said, "What does it feel like?" She said, "More honest." She said, "Not more comfortable, the content is the same. But the mind that knows it is being seen dreams differently than the mind that believes it is completely private." He said, "How?" She said, "With less architecture." She said, "Without the defensive structures that privacy produces in some people." He looked at her. It was the late working room hour. The specific quality of the palace at night when the official functions had concluded and the people still present were there by choice rather than obligation. The fire in the working room's grate had burned to its stable middle. The documentation on the table was the council's second month's reports. He said, "I have been trying to see past something in my dreams." She said, "Yes. The room with many people." He said, "Yes." He said, "Is it still there?" She said, "The room is still there." She said, "The architecture has changed." She said, "There are fewer things blocking the view." He said, "Because of what has changed here." She said, "Yes." She said, "You have been doing the work." She said, "Governance structures do not revise their own architecture. People revise them." He said, "You revised this one." She said, "You revised it." She said, "I provided the documentation." He said, "The documentation required someone to act on it." She said, "Yes." She said, "Oren acted on it first." She said, "You acted on it second." She said, "I provided the documentation." He looked at her with the quality she had been cataloging for 7 weeks, now the full, unguarded attention that she had walked through his dreams and recognized as its truest version, and which she had now received in waking life often enough to understand that it was consistent. It did not vary with audience. It did not change when other people were present. It was simply how he looked at things he was choosing to look at. She thought, "This is the evidence. This is what the base looks like when it is sufficient." She said, "I have been building the evidence." He said, "I know." He said, "How much do you have?" She said, "Enough." He did not ask what that meant. He had learned in 7 weeks that she was precise about language and that enough meant enough. He said, "I would like to take a walk tomorrow morning through the Eastern Gardens." He said, "The section I had the caretakers open last week." She said, "The section that was always locked." He said, "Yes." He said, "I thought it was appropriate." She said, "I would like that." He said nothing more. She said nothing more. The fire in the grate continued burning. The documentation was finished for the night. The palace was quiet around them with the specific quality of a place that had been through something and had arrived somewhere on the other side. 2 years forward. The Dreamwalkers Council had processed 944 submissions in 2 years. Of those, 112 had produced direct governance action. 27 had produced formal proceedings. 6 had produced complete policy reversals, the specific cases where the dreamwalking testimony had revealed, over months of patient navigation, that a standing policy was producing outcomes that the waking governance structure had no visibility into because the outcomes were happening below the threshold of what ranked individuals found worth reporting. The policy reversals had affected approximately 40,000 people in the kingdom's outer territories. None of those 40,000 knew that the changes in their circumstances had originated in the dreams of the people responsible for the circumstances. Neva had decided this was acceptable, that the purpose of the gift was the outcome, not the credit, and that the specific 40,000 were better served by the outcome than they would have been served by knowing its origin. She had told Kale this. He had said, "You have always known that." She had said, "Yes." She had said, "I am telling you so you know it about me." The hierarchy audit's 61 routing changes had been in effect for 21 months. An independent assessment conducted at the 14-month mark had documented a measurable increase in the proportion of low-rank submissions that reached actionable review. The increase was not dramatic. It was real and specific and documented, which was the quality she had always valued most. The linen storage alcove was still there. She had gone back once, in the 2nd month after the proceedings. and stood in the doorway for a while with the specific quality of someone returning to a location that had been important and was now simply a room. She had thought about 11 months of sleeping in that alcove and walking through the palaces. Dreams while the palace assigned her to linen inventory. She had stood there and felt the full shape of it, not the grief of it. She was past the grief, but the specific weight of a thing that had happened and that she was carrying accurately in her memory, rather than softening it into something more comfortable. She had gone back to her current quarters, which were adjacent to the council's working rooms and which had windows that opened toward the eastern garden. The garden Kale had unlocked was now open to anyone who wished to walk in it. He came to the council's working room on a morning in the second autumn. She was reviewing the third-month submissions with two of the council's practitioners, not Oren. Though Oren remained the individual she trusted most with the documentation. But two of the practitioners found through the public inquiry, whose gifts complemented hers in specific ways that had made the council's output more comprehensive than her individual work had been. She was reviewing and annotating with the specific patience of someone who had been doing this work for 2 years and understood what it required. He came in without announcement, which had become his practice. He poured 2 cups of the specific tea that she had mentioned once in the first month that she liked, and set one at her position and took the other to the window. He said, "The Eastern Province Inquiry." She said, "I read the summary last night." He said, "The dream content you documented last week." She said, "Yes." She said, "The 2 accounts are consistent." She said, "The settlement administrator is processing a sustained decision to omit specific financial information from the provincial reporting chain." She said, "I want to send the audit team." He said, "Done." She looked at him. He said, "I read the preparatory document this morning." He said, "Your documentation was in it." She said, "You are reading the preparatory documents now." He said, "I read the preparatory documents now." She said, "All of them." He said, "All of them." He said, "It has been 2 years." He said, "I do not have a reason not to." She received this with the specific quality of evidence landing in an evidence base that was already sufficient but continued to grow, not because she needed more evidence, but because the evidence continued to arrive, and she was a person who recorded what arrived. She said, "The room in your dream." He said, "You are still watching." She said, "It is involuntary." She said, "I navigate away when I can." She said, "I am telling you because you asked about it 6 weeks ago, and I did not answer yet." He said, "And?" She said, "The room is different now." She said, "The people in it are where you can see them." She said, "The thing you were trying to see is visible." He said, "What is it?" She said, "The kingdom." She said, "The actual one." She said, "Not the administrative model of it." He looked at her from the window with the quality she had been documenting for 2 years, and which had not changed in its fundamental character through all that time, the full, unguarded attention of someone who was choosing to look. He said, "I want to show you something in the Eastern Garden." She said, "The part that was always locked." He said, "Yes." He said, "I have been thinking about something that requires being said outside this room." She said, "I know." She said, "I walked your dream last week." He paused. She said, "You were standing in the garden saying something to someone who was standing next to you, and I could not hear what you were saying because the dream sound was muted, and I woke before it resolved." He said, "I can say it now if you want." She looked at him. She said, "Or you can say it in the garden." He said, Or I can say it in the garden. She set the documentation down. She stood up. They walked to the eastern garden, through the door that had always been locked, into the morning light of an autumn that the palace was in the middle of rather than managing from a distance. She stood in the garden with him, and the light was the specific gold of early autumn, and the garden was open to anyone who wished to walk in it, and it smelled of old stone and late flowers and everything that had been locked away for too long and was now simply present. He said what he had been meaning to say in the dream. She listened with her eyes open. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.